Hello and welcome to this session on verbs, and in this session we shall continue our understanding of the various types of verbs. Well, particularly in this session our discussion is going to be on the main verbs and the auxiliary verbs, and let me tell you that this distinction is based on the dependency. Anyway, what I really mean by saying that this distinction is based on dependency, and how based on dependency that we are categorizing the verbs as the main verbs and the auxiliary verbs is what we will have to understand in this session. So let me proceed. Even before I proceed and explain to you as to what really the main verbs and the auxiliary verbs are, let's first focus on these two words, main and auxiliary. What do we really mean by the word main? Well, the word main means primary. The word main means fundamental. The word main means dominant. Well, all of these happen to be the equivalent words of the word main. But then, what does auxiliary mean? Well, auxiliary in many ways is the opposite of main, meaning that it is secondary, it is subsidiary, and so on. So all said and done, through this you have understood broadly as to what really is the difference between the words main and auxiliary. But then what we really have to understand is the distinction between the main verb and the auxiliary verb. So let me proceed. Main verbs, also known as the primary verbs, happen to be such verbs in the sentence that describe the main action or the main state of being of the subject. In fact, these are such verbs that carry the core meaning of the sentence. And as the word main suggests, that these are such verbs that are independent and can stand alone. What I mean to say is that they compulsorily do not require the support of the auxiliary verbs. However, sometimes the main verbs may combine with the auxiliary verbs. Anyway, moving forward, I shall be telling you as to what really the auxiliary verbs are, but then at this point in time, my focus is on the main verbs. So let me give you a few example sentences to clarify as to what really the main verbs are. Have a look at this example. She reads books. Well, here reads happens to be the primary or the fundamental action that is happening, and hence we categorize reads as the main verb. But then what really is the auxiliary verb in this sentence? Well, as I have told you, I shall be speaking about the auxiliary verbs moving forward, but I'm sure at this point in time you can understand that reads, being the dominant action, happens to be the main verb in this sentence. Similarly, have a look at this example. He plays football, and again you know that plays here happens to be the dominant or the major action that is happening, and hence we categorize plays as the main verb. Similarly, have a look at this. She writes essays. Obviously, writes happens to be the main verb in this sentence. And then finally, have a look at this. They visit museums, and in this, visit happens to be the primary action and hence is categorized as the main verb. All said and done, I am sure that through these examples you have been able to clearly understand as to what really the main verbs are, and I am sure that you have a doubt at the back of your mind as to what really the auxiliary verbs are. Well, let me proceed and tell you now as to what really the auxiliary verbs are. Auxiliary verbs are also called as the helping verbs or the secondary verbs. Well, as the name itself suggests, they are secondary, meaning that they do not express the main action that is happening in the sentence. In fact, they do not carry the main meaning on their own, and just that they help in conveying certain additional grammatical meaning. Anyway, the auxiliary verbs are not standalone verbs, meaning that they will always require the support of the main verb. Hence, they always combine with the main verbs to form meaningful sentences. Anyway, all of this shall become completely clear when I shall give you a few examples. So, let me proceed. Have a look at this example. She reads books. Well, you know that here reads happens to be the main activity and hence is categorized as the main verb. After all, you know that main verbs are the verbs that express the main action, and here reads happens to be the main action. Moreover, you also know that the main verbs can stand alone. In other words, they are independent. What I mean to say is that in this sentence, you can notice that we have only the main verb. There is no auxiliary verb, meaning that the main verbs can exist independently. But then you also know that in the characteristics of the main verbs that sometimes the main verbs would combine with the auxiliary verbs. Well, let me give you a case study for that. Have a look at this sentence. She reading books. Well, here forget about what the main verb or the auxiliary verb is. The sentence itself is invalid. No doubt, reading happens to be the main action and hence is the main verb, but then the sentence is an invalid sentence. And how do I make it a valid sentence? Well, I will bring in a word called is. And now you can notice that she is reading books becomes a valid sentence. And the is that I have added here is what is the auxiliary verb. Well, you after all know the characteristics of the auxiliary verb, that auxiliary verbs do not express the main action. Obviously, is not expressing the main action. After all, the main action here is reading, which is expressed by the action verb. But then is definitely an auxiliary verb which is not expressing the main action. In fact, is cannot stand alone also. What I mean to say is that just in case I happen to remove the main verb from this, then it becomes she is books, which is meaningless. In other words, what it means is that the auxiliary verb is always requires the support of the main verb, and here the main verb happens to be reading. So I am sure that you have been able to understand the second characteristic of the auxiliary verb, that they cannot stand alone and they always will have to combine with the main verb. I am sure you have been able to, through this example, understand both the characteristics of the main verbs as well as the characteristics of the auxiliary verbs. Anyway, let me give you one more example. She reading books. Again, it is invalid. No doubt, reading happens to be the main verb in this, but then the sentence happens to be invalid, and I can make this valid by bringing in an auxiliary verb was. And now you can notice that the sentence becomes a valid sentence. However, what you really have to understand here is that no doubt was is an auxiliary verb, but then it will always require the support of the main verb. In case I happen to remove the main verb, then it becomes she was books, which is meaningless. In other words, what I really want you to understand is that the main verbs happen to be such verbs that express the main action. Main verb, as you can notice in the first sentence, is independent and it can stand alone. It does not require the support of the auxiliary verb, but sometimes it would also combine with the auxiliary verbs to create meaningful sentences. But on the contrary, auxiliary verbs do not express any main action as such. They also cannot stand alone and would always combine with the main verbs to create meaningful sentences. I am sure that through this example now you have been able to understand the characteristics of both the main verbs as well as the auxiliary verbs, and anyway, with a few more examples that I shall be giving you, I am sure you will be able to completely understand the concept. Have a look at this second example. He plays football. Obviously, plays happens to be the main action in this sentence and hence is categorized as the main verb. Also, what I want you to notice is that in this sentence we do not have an auxiliary verb, and that is what I mean by saying that the main verbs can stand alone. They always would not require the support of the auxiliary verbs. But then sometimes the main verbs may combine with the auxiliary verbs to create meaningful sentences. What I mean to say is, have a look at this sentence. He playing football. Obviously, here playing no doubt is the main verb, but then the sentence is an invalid sentence. And if you really have to correct this sentence, then I will have to bring in an auxiliary verb and I will bring in is. And now you can notice that he is playing football obviously happens to be a valid statement, with is being the auxiliary verb. But then what I also want you to understand is that the auxiliary verb is not standalone. it always requires the support of the main verb. Just in case I happen to remove the main verb from this, then he is football is a meaningless sentence. All said and done, what I really want you to understand is that the auxiliary verb does not express the main action and it cannot stand alone. It always combines with the main verb. Anyway, have a look at this statement. It is invalid, right? He play football definitely is an invalid sentence, and if I will have to make it valid, then I can bring in an auxiliary verb would. And now you can notice that he would play football is a valid English sentence in which would is the auxiliary verb and play happens to be the main verb. But then, just in case I remove the main verb from this, then the statement is he would football, which is meaningless. So all said and done, what I really want you to understand is that as in the case of the first sentence, you can notice that the main verb can stand alone. The main verbs are independent. They always would not require the support of the auxiliary verb. But then you know that in the second and the third sentences, no doubt the main verb is in association with the auxiliary verb, but then the auxiliary verb are always secondary. They are always subsidiary. They cannot exist independently. They always will have to combine with the main verbs, and just in case the main verbs are removed, then the auxiliary verbs by themselves would not be able to create proper English sentences. I hope now through this example you have been able to get a better understanding of the categorization between the main verbs and the auxiliary verbs. Anyway, let me give you another example. Have a look at these three sentences. Well, the first sentence is a valid sentence and writes happens to be the main action and hence is categorized as the main verb. But then in the second and the third sentences, no doubt written and writing happens to be the main action and hence are categorized as the main verb. But then the sentences are invalid. And to make them valid, I will have to bring in the auxiliary verbs, and in the first instance, I shall bring in has, whereas in the next instance, I shall bring in was. And now you can notice that the sentences becomes valid sentences, and I am sure now in these sentences, you are able to clearly identify as to which verbs happen to be the main verbs and which happens to be the auxiliary verbs. Finally, look at these three sentences. Obviously, the first sentence is a valid sentence with visit being the main action and hence is categorized as the main verb. But then the second and the third sentences are obviously invalid. No doubt, visiting happens to be the main verb in both of these sentences, but then it is not making any sense, and if really some sense has to be added to this sentence, then I will have to bring in the auxiliary verbs. Well, I will bring in were as the auxiliary verb here, and I will bring in are as the auxiliary verb here. And now you can notice that the sentences have become valid sentences. So I'm sure that given any sentence, now you are able to clearly identify as to whether the sentence contains only the main verb, or if in case the sentence contains both the main verb as well as the auxiliary verb, that you can easily distinguish between them. I'm sure you have been able to completely understand now the characteristics of the main verbs. And I'm sure that you have been able to understand the characteristics of the auxiliary verbs as well. And through all of this, I am sure you have been able to understand the second categorization, which was based on the dependency that we had categorized the verbs as main verbs and auxiliary verbs. Why this categorization was based on dependency is to say that the main verb does not have the dependency on the auxiliary verb. It can exist independently. But then the auxiliary verb definitely has the dependency on the main verb. Anyway, all said and done, now I'm sure you have been able to understand two more types of verbs, but then you know that there are many more types of verbs that you really need to understand. And if you have to understand all of these verbs and master the concept of verbs in English and master English as a language, then keep continuing to watch my sessions. Thanks for watching. Let's meet in the next session.